You think you know what a medieval duel looked like. In your mind, it's a grand spectacle. Two knights circling in an open field, blades flashing under the sun, trading dramatic strikes in a battle of honor. Movies and TV have fed us this picture for decades. But here's the hard truth. It's a fantasy. A real medieval duel didn't last minutes. It didn't even last long enough for a crowd to cheer. Most ended in seconds. One misstep, one opening, and it was over. Quick, brutal, and final. There were no choreographed swings, no back and forth dances of steel, just raw survival, where a single blow could crush bone or pierce through armor. This is the myth versus reality you're about to discover. The elegant duels you've seen on screen were designed for entertainment. The real thing? It was chaos, dirty, unforgiving, and far more terrifying than Hollywood would ever dare to show. So the question isn't what you think duels looked like. The real question is, could you survive even 30 seconds in one? Ask anyone to picture a medieval duel, and the same image comes to mind. Two armored men circling cautiously, swords drawn, trading sparks in long, drawn-out exchanges. Hollywood has perfected this illusion, from blockbuster films to fantasy series. The duel is shown as a performance, measured strikes, heroic speeches, and a crowd holding its breath as fighters lock blades in elegant rhythm. It looks almost like a dance, more art than war. But that vision was built for entertainment, not accuracy. Real medieval duels were nothing like this. They weren't graceful contests of honor. They were raw, messy battles where hesitation meant death. A knight didn't waste time with fancy spins or endless clashing blades. He went for the kill as quickly as possible. Most fights ended in one or two decisive moves: a dagger driven through a visor, a mace shattering bone beneath a helmet, a sword thrust into the gaps of armor. Even the idea of fairness is largely a myth. We imagine evenly matched opponents meeting under strict rules, but many duels were brutal trials by combat, decided not by chivalry, but by desperation and circumstance. Weapons were chosen to exploit weaknesses, terrain was used for advantage, and dirty techniques, grappling, wrestling, tripping, were not only common but essential. Armor itself changes the entire story. Movies show endless sword-on-sword sparks, but in reality, armored knights often grappled, slammed each other to the ground, and finished the fight with short, brutal thrusts of daggers into exposed joints. It wasn't cinematic, it was shockingly efficient. The myth of the duel comforts us with spectacle. The reality strips that away, leaving violence that is sudden, ugly, and final. And once you see the truth, you'll never look at those movie duels the same way again. When you strip away the Hollywood illusion, what truly defined medieval duels were the weapons and armor. Forget the endless swordplay. Knights didn't always rely on their longswords, and when they did, it wasn't used in the way movies suggest. Real combat was about exploiting weaknesses, and every piece of equipment was designed with lethal efficiency. Take the sword, for example. We think of it as the ultimate dueling weapon, yet it was often secondary. Against armored opponents, swords were far less effective than people assume. Knights would grip their blades halfway up, half swording, to use them like spears, driving the point into the gaps of armor. A sword strike wasn't about flashy swings. It was about precision thrusts into armpits, throats, and joints. It was controlled, deliberate, and terrifyingly practical. Maces and warhammers, meanwhile, were brutal equalizers. A single blow could crush a helmet, shatter ribs, or disable an opponent without ever piercing armor. These weapons didn't rely on finesse. They relied on raw, bone-breaking force. To face a man swinging one of these wasn't cinematic. It was catastrophic. Daggers, too, played a shocking role in real duels. Known as rondel daggers, they were narrow and stiff, perfect for slipping through visor slits or stabbing into exposed gaps. Once a knight had wrestled his opponent to the ground, the dagger became the execution tool, fast, efficient, and horrifyingly personal. And then there were polearms. Spears, halberds, and poleaxes dominated many duels because of their reach and versatility. A halberd could hook an opponent's leg, pull him off balance, then deliver a crushing axe strike in the same motion. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They were designed to end fights instantly. Armor itself is perhaps the most misunderstood element. Movies depict it as clunky and restrictive, slowing knights into lumbering targets. Reality couldn't be more different. Properly made plate armor allowed surprising mobility. Knights could run, roll, climb, and wrestle in full gear. The design wasn't about looking imposing, it was about surviving. Steel deflected sword cuts, absorbed mace strikes, and forced combat into brutal close-quarters grappling. That's why duels often looked less like elegant sword fights and more like vicious wrestling matches. Combatants slammed into each other, locked arms, and fought for leverage. Once on the ground, the fight was nearly over. The victor drove a dagger into a weak spot or used sheer strength to crush the life out of his opponent. Every weapon, every piece of armor, and every technique was created with one truth in mind: efficiency. The goal wasn't to fight for long, it was to kill quickly and decisively. So next time you see a medieval duel portrayed as a drawn-out sword ballet, remember, the real fights weren't about entertainment. They were about survival, and survival depended on steel, blood, and speed. History is filled with tales of duels, but the reality behind them is far darker than the romanticized versions we've come to believe. Medieval duels were rarely noble tests of skill. They were violent encounters where survival and brutality ruled. Let's step into some of the most striking examples. One of the most infamous cases was the 1386 duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris in France. This was not entertainment. It was a judicial trial by combat meant to let God decide guilt or innocence. Both men were fully armored, armed with lances, swords, and daggers. The fight was brutal and exhausting, ending with Carouge's forcing Le Gris to the ground and stabbing him through the throat. It wasn't a duel of honor. It was a savage legal execution in front of nobles and commoners alike. Another chilling example comes from the German tradition of judicial duels. Fencing manuals of the 14th and 15th centuries show armored knights grappling, slamming each other into the ground, and finishing with a dagger to the visor. These manuals weren't artistic. They were practical guides. They reveal that duels weren't lengthy contests of blade on blade, but wrestling matches in steel that ended in seconds once one fighter lost balance. Even more shocking were duels between peasants and nobles, sometimes demanded by law. Imagine a farmer, terrified but forced into combat, standing against a trained warrior. In some cases, peasants used clubs, stones, or improvised weapons. These weren't fair fights, they were desperate struggles where cunning and luck sometimes overturned social order. A single well-placed strike could humiliate a knight, proving that armor and training weren't always guarantees of victory. Then there were tournament duels. While we imagine tournaments as pageantry, the line between sport and death was razor thin. In jousts, a splintered lance could pierce through armor and kill instantly. Even in controlled settings, knights often died or suffered crippling injuries. These were not games. They were brutal showcases of violence dressed as entertainment for lords and ladies. One lesser-known case from German law is the trial by combat between a man and a woman, where the woman was given a rock in a sling, and the man was forced to fight waist-deep in a pit to make it fair. Manuals show drawings of these bizarre duels, proof that medieval combat was as much about spectacle as it was about cruelty. We also cannot ignore the role of duels fought for vengeance or political stakes. In Italy, rival nobles often settled disputes with duels in front of witnesses. These fights were rarely even-handed. Ambushes, hidden daggers, or sudden lunges ended them quickly. The winner didn't become a hero. He simply eliminated a rival. The consistent theme across all these examples is speed and finality. Whether knight against knight, peasant against noble, or man against woman in bizarre trial setups, medieval duels almost always ended swiftly and brutally. There was no prolonged dance of steel, just seconds of chaos followed by silence. So when you picture a medieval duel, Strip away the polished armor, the dramatic circling, and the romantic speeches. Replace it with mud, blood, and desperation. Replace it with crushed bones, broken visors, and daggers shoved through steel. These weren't stories of noble combat. They were raw survival, where only one walked away. What made medieval duels even more terrifying wasn't just the weapons or the armor, it was the mindset. Imagine stepping into a fight where there were no rules, no referees, no safety nets. Every swing of the sword, every thrust of the spear, every grapple in the mud carried one simple truth: one of you was going to die. That knowledge alone shattered most men long before the blades even touched. Knights trained their entire lives to face this reality. From childhood, they were conditioned to see death not as a fear, but as an expectation. They drilled endlessly, wore armor until it felt like skin, and practiced killing strikes until hesitation was gone. For them, walking into a duel wasn't about proving bravery, it was about fulfilling a duty. The calm, the focus, the relentless drive to win came from a lifetime of preparation. Now compare that to a commoner forced into trial by combat. For him, this wasn't training, it was terror. He stood in the pit, facing a fully armed opponent, knowing his survival depended on sheer desperation. Many broke mentally before the fight even began, their fear as lethal as any weapon. This psychological clash, the conditioned confidence of a knight versus the desperate dread of the untrained, defined the reality of duels. Movies show courage and honor. Reality shows fear, adrenaline, and the crushing weight of knowing you might not live to see another sunrise. So now you know the truth. Medieval duels weren't grand spectacles of honor, but brutal moments of survival. They ended in seconds, not minutes. They were fought with crushing maces, piercing daggers, and bone-shattering polearms, not just elegant swords. They were decided by fear, speed, and precision, not by drawn-out choreography. And above all, they revealed a psychological gulf, the trained, conditioned mindset of a knight versus the raw terror of anyone unlucky enough to face him. The myths we've grown up with, slow-motion sword fights, noble speeches, glorious endings, exist only in stories and films. Strip those away, and the reality is darker, dirtier, and far more terrifying. Real duels were chaos turned into silence, lives decided in a heartbeat. So ask yourself, if you were thrust into that world, standing in the mud, armor pressing against your chest, your enemy's blade already moving, how long would you last? 30 seconds, 10, or none at all? The stage is yours. Do you believe modern training and fitness could change the outcome? Or were medieval warriors simply on another level entirely? Let's settle the debate. Drop your answer in the comments below.